There was a time when an American automobile was not simply transportation. It was a statement. A Cadillac could look like a spaceship. A Chevrolet could look like a rocket. A Buick could look like something designed for a future that had not yet arrived. Cars wore enormous chrome grills, sweeping bodies, dramatic tail fins in colors that seemed almost impossible. In post-war America, the automobile became one of the greatest expressions of ambition the industrial world had ever seen. And Detroit was its capital. But then something changed. The cars became safer, cleaner, more efficient, smaller, more standardized, and, many would argue, less beautiful. The transformation is usually blamed on oil prices, or government regulation, or Japanese competition, or the end of the muscle car era. All of those explanations contain some truth. But they miss the deeper strategic story, because the golden age of American automotive design did not simply disappear. Detroit made a series of choices that gradually made it disappear. And one of those choices reveals a business lesson far bigger than the automobile industry. To understand what happened, we have to go back to the beginning. In the 1920s, most automobile companies treated design primarily as an engineering problem. Build the engine, build the chassis, put a body around it, sell it. Then General Motors made a radical move. In 1927, GM President Alfred Sloan hired a young designer named Harley Earl and created what became the company's art and color section. It was revolutionary. For the first time, automobile styling was elevated into a specialized corporate function inside a major automaker. Earl understood something that many engineers did not. People don't only buy what a product does. They buy what the product makes them feel. Under Earl, GM developed systematic styling processes, clay modeling, and eventually the concept car tradition. The famous Buick Wajub, unveiled in 1938, is widely regarded as the first concept car. It wasn't simply meant to be sold. It was meant to show people what the future could look like. That was a profound strategic idea. Design was no longer decoration. Design became demand creation. And Detroit mastered it. Then came one of the most powerful commercial strategies in American consumer history, the annual model change. Every year the car could look different, sometimes dramatically different. You didn't necessarily need your old car to stop working before you wanted a new one. You simply needed to see something that looked newer, bigger, faster, more exciting. The automobile became a moving billboard for the future, and the competition became brutal. If Chevrolet introduced something spectacular, Ford had to respond. If Ford changed its design, Chrysler had to respond. The result was an extraordinary period of experimentation. Tail fins, wraparound windshields, hardtops, two-tone paint, chrome, longer bodies, lower roofs, more powerful engines, and increasingly dramatic styling. The American automobile industry had discovered something that modern businesses still struggle to understand: Bayreuth. A product can create a market by creating desire. The 1950s became the high water. The tail fin became one of the defining symbols of the era, reaching its peak around the late 1950s and early 1960s. And then Detroit made its first subtle transition. In 1958, Harley Earl retired from General Motors. His successor was Bill Mitchell. Mitchell was talented, very talented, but he represented a different design philosophy. Earl had helped create an era of extravagant styling. Mitchell wanted to move away from some of it. He pushed GM toward cleaner forms, less chrome, and away from the enormous fins associated with Earl's era. And this matters, because the end of the golden age was not simply the moment Detroit stopped making beautiful cars. It was the beginning of a shift in what design was supposed to accomplish. Under Earl, design was heavily associated with aspiration and visual differentiation. Over time, design became increasingly constrained by engineering, regulation, cost, manufacturing complexity, and market segmentation. That transformation wasn't necessarily wrong. In fact, much of it was unavoidable. But it changed the game. And then the external environment changed dramatically. By the late 1960s, America was becoming increasingly concerned about two things: safety and pollution. Automobiles were getting larger and more powerful, but public criticism of the industry was increasing. Ralph Nader's 1965 book, Unsafe at Any Speed, intensified public scrutiny of automobile safety. Congress responded with major safety legislation. The 1966 National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act led to new federal safety standards affecting automobiles from the late 1960s onward. Then came environmental regulation. In 1970, the Clean Air Act established much tougher automobile emissions requirements, including a goal of dramatically reducing emissions from new automobiles. The EPA began testing vehicle fuel economy in 1971. The rules were no longer optional. Detroit had to change. And then came the event that changed the economics of the automobile almost overnight, the 1973 oil crisis. Oil prices surged. Americans suddenly cared much more about fuel consumption. The giant American automobile that had once symbolized prosperity suddenly began to look expensive to operate. And foreign manufacturers had something Detroit did not have in abundance: experience building smaller, efficient vehicles. The strategic environment had changed. But here is where the story becomes interesting. Detroit now faced a brutal equation: make cars smaller, but make them safer; make them cleaner, but keep them affordable; reduce fuel consumption, but satisfy emission standards; add safety equipment, but don't add too much weight; maintain performance, but reduce engine size; and somehow keep consumers excited. This was extraordinarily difficult. The automobile industry had to invest heavily in completely new areas of engineering: emissions, fuel economy, safety, materials, manufacturing. The national academies later described the regulatory environment of the period as having a significant influence on the design and manufacture of American automobiles. The problem wasn't that regulation existed. Many of those regulations addressed genuine social problems. The strategic problem was something else. How would Detroit respond? Would it reinvent the automobile? Or would it attempt to preserve the old model while making it compliant with the new environment? This is the decision that is rarely discussed. Detroit largely chose adaptation over reinvention. Instead of asking, what should the American automobile become, the industry increasingly had to ask, how do we make our existing automobile comply with the new rules? That sounds like a subtle difference. It wasn't. It was enormous. The old automobile business was built around scale, size, horsepower, brand hierarchy, and styling differentiation. The new environment rewarded efficiency, compactness, engineering discipline, and responsiveness to changing consumer preferences. Detroit had to transition from one competitive system to another. But large organizations rarely abandon a successful formula voluntarily. They optimize it. They defend it. They modify it. They add features. They redesign components. They cut costs. They adjust the product. But they don't necessarily question the underlying model. And that is exactly where strategic decline begins. The result became known as the Malaise era. American automobiles became heavier, slower, and increasingly constrained by emissions and safety requirements. The spectacular horsepower wars of the 1960s began to fade. Some cars became boxier. Some became visually similar. Luxury styling increasingly relied on features such as vinyl roofs, opera windows, and ornamental details. Meanwhile, the traditional American formula was under attack from every direction. Fuel was more expensive. Regulation was stricter. Consumers were becoming more interested in smaller cars, and foreign competitors were becoming increasingly relevant. The numbers tell the story. In 1975, imported cars represented about 18.3% of U.S. sales. American brands were having one of their weakest sales years in more than a decade. This was not simply a styling crisis. It was a business model crisis disguised as a styling crisis. This is perhaps the most important part of the story. Japanese automakers did not simply beat Detroit because they produced smaller cars. They were developing capabilities around efficiency, quality, manufacturing discipline, and consumer value. A Volkswagen Golf, Toyota Corolla, or Honda Civic did not need enormous dimensions or enormous engines to create value. The competitive question had changed. Detroit was still asking, how impressive can we make this automobile? The emerging competitors were increasingly asking, and how efficiently can we deliver what the customer actually needs? That distinction is strategic gold. Because businesses rarely lose because competitors copy their products. They lose because competitors redefine the basis of competition. Then Washington formalized the new reality. The Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975 established corporate average fuel economy standards. Passenger car fuel economy was required to rise substantially, with the standard eventually reaching 27.5 miles per gallon by 1985. The rules forced American automakers to redesign their fleets, but the problem was that regulation was only one part of the equation. The customer was changing too. The oil shocks had taught Americans that fuel efficiency mattered. Foreign manufacturers were offering alternatives, and Detroit's traditional advantage was weakening. The strategic lesson is uncomfortable. Sometimes, the most dangerous competitor is not the company that produces a better version of your product. It is the company that makes your old definition of value irrelevant. Detroit still had enormous advantages. Factories, capital, engineering talent, distribution networks, recognizable brands, millions of loyal customers. But those strengths also became weaknesses. Why? Because existing assets create pressure to protect existing economics. If you have enormous factories designed to build large vehicles, you have an incentive to keep building large vehicles. If your brand hierarchy depends on premium size and horsepower, downsizing threatens the hierarchy. If your dealers are accustomed to selling a certain product mix, changing the mix creates resistance. And if your organization has spent decades perfecting one formula, the formula itself becomes difficult to question. This is a phenomenon that exists far beyond automobiles. Banks experience it. Telecommunications companies experience it. Universities experience it. Oil companies experience it. Technology companies experience it. A successful organization often becomes a prisoner of the system that made it successful. By the late 1970s, Detroit could no longer ignore reality. General Motors began downsizing its full-size models. Ford followed. Chrysler moved aggressively towards smaller front-wheel drive vehicles. The automobile was changing. But something had been lost. The old design philosophy had treated the automobile almost like a piece of sculpture. The new automobile increasingly had to satisfy a complicated matrix of constraints. Safety, fuel economy, emissions, cost, manufacturing, aerodynamics, insurance, consumer expectations, regulation. The designer was no longer operating in an open playground. The playground had become a maze, and yet this still wasn't the end of American automotive creativity. That is important, because the simplistic story that government regulations killed American design is wrong. The regulations created constraints, but constraints can produce innovation. The deeper failure was the industry's difficulty in turning those constraints into a new source of competitive advantage. Think about that. American companies still had extraordinary designers. They still produced remarkable automobiles. The Corvette survived. The Mustang survived. Cadillac survived. Chrysler eventually reinvented itself around new products. And American automotive design would later experience several revivals. So what actually died? Not creativity, not engineering talent, not American manufacturing capability. What died was a particular strategic relationship between design and the market. During the Golden Age, design could make people want something they had not previously considered necessary. A car could create aspiration. By the 1970s, design increasingly had to operate within a much more complicated economic and regulatory framework. The automobile had become a system, and Detroit was learning how to manage the system while competitors were learning how to redefine it. There is a sentence that destroys more companies than bad strategy. It sounds harmless. It sounds rational. It sounds responsible. And it often begins with, "We have always done it this way." Detroit had spent decades becoming incredibly good at making the American automobile. But the problem was that the definition of the American automobile was changing. And when the environment changes, operational excellence can become strategic inertia. You can become extremely efficient at doing something the market is gradually becoming less interested in. That is one of the most dangerous positions a company can occupy. So what does the story of Detroit teach us? First, never confuse the product with the business model. Detroit's product was the automobile, but its business model was much broader, large-scale production, annual styling changes, brand hierarchy, horsepower, size, and increasingly sophisticated product segmentation. When the environment changed, the product had to change. But more importantly, the underlying model had to change. Second, regulation. Regulation can be a threat or a catalyst. The new safety and environmental rules were initially viewed as constraints, but companies that learn to design around constraints can eventually turn them into advantages. The question isn't simply, what does the new regulation prevent us from doing? The better question is, what new capabilities does this regulation force us to develop before our competitors? Third, don't wait for the crisis to make your strategy obvious. The oil crisis didn't suddenly create the problem. It exposed a vulnerability that already existed. Companies often blame disruption for their decline, but disruption usually reveals weaknesses that were already present. And finally, the customer changes before the organization does. By the time the industry recognizes that customer preferences have shifted, the competitor may already have built the capabilities required to serve the new customer. And here is the great irony of the story. The same country that once produced the world's most extravagant automobiles eventually became a place where some of its biggest manufacturers struggled to respond to smaller, more efficient competitors. The automobile had once been America's symbol of industrial dominance. Then the automobile became one of the clearest demonstrations of what happens when an industry mistakes market leadership for permanent superiority. The Golden Age didn't end because Americans suddenly stopped loving beautiful cars. It ended because the environment that made that particular form of automotive excellence commercially dominant disappeared. And the industry had to decide what came next. So, what was the hidden decision that ended the Golden Age? It wasn't the 1973 oil crisis. It wasn't one regulation. It wasn't Japanese competition. And it wasn't simply the retirement of Harley Earl. Those were events. The deeper decision was strategic. Detroit spent too much energy trying to preserve the old definition of automotive value, while the market was creating a new one. The old world valued size, power, chrome, status, visual drama. The emerging world increasingly valued efficiency, reliability, safety, economy, quality, practicality. The companies that recognized the shift earliest gained an advantage. And this is why the story of American automotive design isn't really a story about cars. It is a story about strategy, because every successful company eventually faces the same question Detroit faced. What happens when the thing that made us successful is no longer what the customer values most? You can defend the old model. You can optimize it. You can lobby against the change. You can blame competitors. You can blame regulation. You can blame the economy. Or you can reinvent yourself before the market forces you to. That is the difference between adaptation and transformation. And it is one of the most important lessons in business history. The greatest threat to a successful company is often not failure. It is becoming too successful at yesterday's strategy. This is the Strategy Lens Global, where we don't just study what happened, we study why it happened and what it means for the decisions businesses make today. Thank you for watching the Strategy Lens. Subscribe and become part of a community committed to seeing beyond the obvious. The Strategy Lens, seeing beyond the obvious.